Good morning. My name is Sheila Barrett Carroll. I am a graphic designer with the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, and I work in the North Carolina Historical Research and Publications Office. Welcome to our August Flyleaf. We are joined by Dr. Adrienne Berney. Adrienne is an outreach coordinator for the State Archives of North Carolina. She joined the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources in 2010 and works with museums and history organizations across the state through the Connecting to Collections project, the Federation of North Carolina Historical Societies, and she's a traveling archivist with the Traveling Archivist Program. Adrienne holds a PhD in American History from the University of Delaware. We are welcoming Adrienne because she wrote an article in the July 2020 North Carolina Historical Review about Christena Kells's Heirloom, a North Carolina example of hairwork. So Adrienne, what exactly is hairwork? I understand that it was popular in the late 19th century. How did you become interested in this? And can you describe what is hairwork?
Sure. So hairwork is a craft, mostly a women's fancy craft. And it started really in jewelry, even earlier than that, in the late 18th century. And that's kind of a version of it I haven't delved into too much, but it's in a locket or behind a portrait miniature, kind of a brooch size. And over time, jewelers took this on and it became more and more elaborate and weaving, braiding, very intricate designs. And I have a slide of that I'll pull up in a little bit. But over time, more women who had some leisure of European descent, because this was on both sides of the Atlantic, was very popular in England and associated with Queen Victoria and some of her stylistic influences by the mid-19th century. And so it became more and more of a middle class pastime for women who may have some leisure in their household, because it was something that required a great deal of skill and time and just a very complex form of handwork. So we'll take a look at some of those images and folks can see that sort of detail. And it's hard to imagine today how those got created, because I think all that producerist skill is a little bit beyond us now. But sometimes in jewelry shops, they'd hire special people to do that, special skilled workers. But women at home could take that on too. And your other part of your question was, how did I get interested in it? So I have, as a kid, my mom had a little piece of hair work that was her grandmother's. And it was in a little piece of jewelry, a little charm, a gold charm with some woven hair. And it was inscribed with a suitor's name, I guess. It wasn't my great-grandfather, so someone before she got married and on Valentine's Day. So I kind of knew about it. And then I managed a house museum called the 1850 House in New Orleans decades ago. And there they have a hair wreath. So I really got interested in hair wreaths then. And most of them are not well documented. So when I came across correspondence about the hair wreath that I'll be talking more about, I was amazed because it was so well documented. And I thought, there's not a lot of scholarship on hair work. There are a few great articles and a book that came out in 2007. So I encourage folks who are interested to take a look at that book called Love Entwined, about hair work in America. But there's not a lot of scholarship about it. And because so few are well documented, I thought this is a really important example to share with other scholars and other researchers on different levels who may be interested in learning more about hair work, and specifically.
Well, that leads me to my next question. So Christena Kells's example of hair work, I don't want to get ahead of anything, but that particular piece, and correct me if I'm wrong, Adrienne, that is at the 1897 Poe House Museum of the Cape Fear in Fayetteville. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And that's one of the branch museums of the North Carolina Museum of History. And the Cape Fear Museum Complex has several buildings, but that historic house is part of it, and it's in the parlor there. So would this be a good time for me to show slides and show the slide of the wreath, and then where it sits in the parlor? Okay.
That would be great. And if you could also talk about what is the significance of this?
Okay, I think it's going to come up in just a second.
Okay.
So a lot of times we hear about all hair work lumped together as a mourning custom, that maybe locks would be clipped from the head of some dead loved one and then fashioned into something more decorative, either in jewelry or otherwise. And that was a part of early hair work when it started, as I was describing, in jewelry and in lockets. It was often associated with mourning. But then sometime in the mid-19th century, that started to change, and hair work was more from the living, a way to memorialize your family or your loved ones. In the case of this piece in my family, it was something to commemorate, you know, a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, a courting relationship in the late 19th century. And so it became different from death. In some of these assemblages, like Christena Kell's wreath here, and I hope you're seeing that image now.
Yes, I'm seeing it. So the wreath, and there's hair. And can you tell me, for the viewers, the butterflies and the flowers, are those hair as well?
Yes, they are. So all of that is created from hair. And again, it's just very intricately worked. These wreaths relied on sort of industrial consumer products that some of the earlier jewelry may not have relied on. It's a leisure time kind of skilled activity that they could do. And a lot of that hair was woven tightly or braided around wire. So those flowers often had a little wire frame inside them, and you'll see a butterfly too. And one really different aspect of this hair wreath from the other wreaths that I've come across in studying them is those blonde pearls that aren't really a flower or a butterfly or any other formed shape. I believe those were added later in the 1940s by Christena Kell's granddaughter, and those are from her son. So it was still kind of a cherished family memento generations later, and even added to, I believe, from the documentation we have from her granddaughter.
So how did people learn how to do this? Did they have guides or periodicals that they followed? Was this something that they learned in the community? What can you talk about that?
Yeah, so and there's a lot I don't know. I mean, I definitely think there's some room for more research about how this knowledge was shared. But certainly by the 1850s, common women's periodicals like Godey's Ladies Book were talking about ways to use hair in jewelry. So again, more like a clipping of a lock that would be very simple. And so a little bit later, once you have that thin black wire and beads and so forth a little more available by the 1870s, you see things like in the slide I'm showing right now, a women's household guide that talks about different forms of fancy work. And hair work was certainly not the only one. Other types may be more familiar to a range of people, like shell work, bead work, wax flowers. People could take anything and create flowers out of it and make it a parlor decoration. So it was part of this quintessential Victorian parlor with a lot of layers of textiles and color and just bric-a-brac. And so this particular household guide shows a few designs specifically for hair work. So and so you may be able to see beyond our talking heads, the different designs of roses, leaves and tendrils, and other sorts of flowers. And so those were all specific designs for hair work that this guide had in one section of a variety of fancy work that they were recommending women attempt.
Artisans were nimble fingered, and you mentioned wire being used and also hair. What were some of the other tools that the artisans used to create these wreaths and jewelry?
So we, again, back to the Christena Kells wreath, we have great documentation from her granddaughter. And the granddaughter was leaving the wreath to her granddaughter in the 1980s. And she wrote this long, let's see, maybe I'll get to it, bounce around, there we go. She wrote this long letter to her granddaughter saying, I'm leaving you this hair wreath that I watched my grandmother make in 1911-ish. And she used knitting needles and wire, and the wreaths also typically incorporated beads. So it was a way to kind of attach the hair or to almost pin that form together. And let's see, I'm going to jump around to another slide. If I can. And show some of the, here we go. Okay, so on this slide, I want to show a little bit more about the jeweler's craft and how there's a machine that the jewelers could use. And you could also develop something like this at home, although I think primarily it's more complex for what would be done at home. This kind of machine would help form those really elaborate braided patterns that you don't see so much in hair wreaths. Again, those are a little more simple patterns to use with wire, but this would be a very elaborate woven or braided design for jewelry. And this is another piece in the North Carolina Museum of History's collection. But you can see that sort of wheel that the jeweler is using, and he can turn the wheel and braid many, many different strands at once. So that's another tool, but probably not what you find at home.
In the engraving, Adrienne, is he holding hair? Is that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
With little weights on the end. And I'm not sure what those would have been made out of, but little weights to kind of keep it flat and keep it taut to be able to braid those really fine strands.
And then the barrette that's on my left.
Yeah.
I'm amazed. It's made out of hair.
Yeah.
Hair and wire.
Well, that's probably just the hair. That's just the hair with a gold clasp.
Okay.
Yeah. So just by bringing together tiny strands, very, very thin strands of just a few hairs, and weaving them, braiding them in this kind of pattern around maybe, something that could slide out to leave that hollow tube shape.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have never tried it. It seems really complicated and it would be very frustrating, I think. But But yeah, there were directions for this kind of thing and jewelers that specialized in it.
Were there some areas in North Carolina where this was more popular than in other areas of the state?
I'm not sure about that. I think that it was really pretty widespread as far as periodicals and home guides go.
Mm-hmm.
The larger cities advertised that there were jewelers who did this sort of thing. So I've found advertisements from Charlotte and advertising jewelers, advertising classes for young women in hair work.
Mm-hmm.
And I found newspaper advertisements in Salisbury, Fayetteville. So any larger town that had jewelry stores may have someone who was a specialist in this.
Okay.
And then another thing that I've found in newspapers, and I think it would be great if anyone's really interested in researching this more, there's some room there, is that a lot of the state fairs and county fairs had, women's expos or women's exhibits and would show off handiwork the same way our state fair today has preserves or cake or different crafts and competitions. And so hair work would have been a regular category in those competitions. And I've found references to that in the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s. And so primarily in the East, I don't think that means that this was only done in Eastern North Carolina. I just think that that's what the documents that we have are mostly newspapers from the East that I've been able to search through at least.
But
so
then
I
you
think
also mentioned in your family that that your mom had some pieces as well.
Yeah, one piece, and my ancestors really aren't from North Carolina. We may have one relative that came from North Carolina many generations ago. So I think it was really all over these instructional manuals and articles. And I guess I've seen some evidence that Mormons especially gravitated toward this craft and continue to do it in some ways, or at least continued well into the 20th century, like the 1980s, beyond where most, it had sort of dissipated. So that's really the only, and not that Mormon communities are only in the West, but obviously the highest density is in Utah and surrounding states. So that would be the only regional notion I have of it. But I think a lot of rural women must have been aware of it, and the more skilled ones were doing it if they were showcasing their work at these state fairs and county fairs.
I would like to mention to everybody that if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we will be happy to answer them. Now, another question, Adrienne, that I had is not all beholders of hair work during the peak of the late 19th century appreciated the product as domestic decorative art. So let's talk about that. And I can see that you also included a map of Christena's homes. And where
so I guess I scrolled over to this slide just to talk about regions and how it's not associated with any region. And I'll come back to that last question in a moment. But Christena Kells was born in Pennsylvania and moved around quite a bit in her adult life before finally her final residence was in Durham in the 1910s. And her family, many generations of her family since have stayed in North Carolina. So that's why the wreath was probably created while she was living here and has been in North Carolina most of the time since then. But she moved around, and who knows when she started doing this, because I know they would take a long time to make. But okay, so now I think what you're referring to is I did find a passage in a newspaper about someone maybe in the 1890s who was writing a story and talking about hair ornaments on the mantle being ghastly mementos. And that sentiment is more in line with what people in the late 20th and 21st century normally think. A lot of people see hair work and hair wreaths and think, oh, that's gross. How could anyone wear that? Or how could even touch it or want to decorate their houses with? So there's been this big shift in the appeal of it, where it was something that seemed sentimental and appropriate for home decor, and then something that seemed kind of tainted, maybe with germs or dust, or just a distasteful reaction for people in the modern era. And I guess that's one of the reasons that this topic appeals to me so much, is because the big change in reaction to it just seems so emblematic of the Victorian era. And as it ended, modernity, the modern era started with the 20th century, and how aesthetics changed so dramatically. So that's really interesting to me. And it kind of gets at a huge question of what drives these sorts of aesthetic and cultural changes. And I think that one article points to, usually there's not a uniform acceptance or denial of any one thing, but there are sort of waves of acceptance. So you may have many people were thinking, oh, this is great for the women with some leisure who have the skill and can do this at home, and it's a very attractive addition to the parlor. But at the same time, in the same period, you'd have a few people who might voice an opposite opinion. And as other things shift, those few people, their opinions are going to grow more in popularity and resonate more with more and more people. And then culture changes. But it's not ever a neat all or nothing linear kind of change. So the hair wreath topic gets at that a little bit. And that's just a very big topic that's hard to really have a clear cut cause and effect, how that change happens.
Well, what were some of the other art forms that emerged in the 20th century to lead towards the decline of hair work?
So again, it's not a clear-cut cause and effect, but that sentimental idea of hair work or a hair wreath being something to gather family love and associations with,
Mm-hmm.
kind of shifted over to photos and photo albums, but it wasn't an immediate change there. And those things coexisted for many years. In fact, in some ways still do. I know for my own babies, I keep baby books and little locks of hair with their baby books, and I've tried to keep their baby teeth, but those do dry out and crack over time. So hair is a lot more of a stable material and can be preserved without a lot of extra steps for many, many years. This is a really interesting example, I think, of that, where from the Mount Airy Museum. And it's a 1945 yearbook, high school yearbook, where the young woman who owned it collected teachers and friends' little locks of hair and taped them into the yearbook. So, the hair as a relic and as a sentimental connection to a loved one, that practice continued for many decades and still does in some ways. But that skill got lost along the way, and the aesthetic for these elaborate creations to keep in the parlor also went away.
So in your article, you're specifically, let's talk about this. What was that?
Okay. So, I wanted to show the Poe house, and there's a view of the parlor. And again, this is where Christena Kell's hair wreath is now. It's on display in the Poe house. and that's in Fayetteville. And so if you ever go visit, you'll be able to check it out in person there. And then I also wanted to show a couple other examples of hair wreaths that I've seen in smaller museums across the state. And again, North Carolina doesn't have any special claim to this art and craft form, but many small museums anywhere may have this if they have a collecting period from the late Victorian era. And so Stanley County and Sampson County museums both have hair wreaths, and also the May Museum in Farmville has more examples, which I don't have pictured, but these are both more typical in that they're not well documented. The Stanley County example on the left has a brass plaque that just says circa 1870 hair lace wreath, and that's really all it says, and that plaque may well have been added later. And then the second one on the right is attributed to the Boykin family and the 1850s, although I would suggest that it's 1870s at the earliest and probably more likely closer to 1900. And then I have one more example to show from a small museum, if I can. There we go. So the Belhaven Museum has another one that's got some good documentation. So it's got some clues. And again, very few hair wreaths in these small museums have anything more than just a vague family connection. But this one, we know the name of the maker, and the maker actually went through and put little taped names beside each section of hair that she worked into a flower or a butterfly. You'll see the big butterfly in the center. And most of them are Bowman relatives. So probably, her parents and siblings and more distant relatives. So it's a little it's possible with this one, because we know her birth year and death year, that she's really a contemporary of Christena Kells, and this wreath was likely made about the same time as Christena Kells. And Christena Kells was born just about eight to 10 years, depending on which document you go with, before Nellie Bowman Frisbee was. So they were really contemporaries. And this is, I would say, a later wreath. I think, most women who had families were unlikely to have the kind of leisure that it would take to do this sort of project until their children were grown. And that also meant that they had many, many decades of handwork skill built up. So those were the women probably who were making these. Unless they were professionals employed in jewelry shops, they were the ones that had many decades of handwork behind them and knew what they were doing and could use knitting needles and anything else. Corset staves was another tool that Christena Kell's granddaughter mentioned. And they could use those simple tools and wire that they could buy at a local general store and beads and put something like this together, and maybe order a shadow box to encase it in from either a store or a mail order catalog.
Adrienne, we have a question. Does the Poe Museum have a lot of hairwork pieces in their collection? And then that would lead me to one of our final questions of talk about how Christena Kell's family preserved the keepsake and then turned it over to the museum.
Mm-hmm. So I don't believe the Poe Museum has many or any other examples of hairwork, and I can't say that definitively, but I have searched through the online collections catalog at the Museum of History, and I'm sure one of their staff would be able to answer that more definitively. But the Museum of History, so storage in Raleigh, contains a number of other hair wreaths, probably 4 more, and none of them are very well documented. We know one came from an antique store in Wilmington. So again, we just don't know who created it and the exact year that it was created. But I don't think the Poe House has any of those in its storage or display areas. But again, if you're really interested in that, please verify that with a staff member there, because someone else would know that more precisely. And so remind me, Sheila, what was the other part of the question?
So Christena Kells' family preserved the hair wreath
Right.
very
Yeah.
well.
Yes. So I'll see if I can get back to I don't know if I can get back to one of the slides that show her documentation, but I'm just getting a grinding symbol here. Let's see.
So at some point, the family decided that they would like to
Yeah. So what happens
share
is
the community.
to the best of my knowledge, and I've learned a little more about this from the provenance that we have in this slide from these documents, from one of Christena Kell's great grandchildren.
Mhm.
And he believes that she made a wreath for each of her 3 daughters who had households of their own at this time, at around 1911, because his grandparents had one and their house was destroyed in a fire in the 1920s, but he had visited another relative who had one. So she may have done that. And her granddaughter, Ruby, inherited the wreath that she made for Ruby's mother. And Ruby kept it and probably added to it in the 40s with her own son's little blonde curls, as we saw earlier. And then as Ruby was approaching the end of her life, she was sort of looking for places what place could preserve her most prized possessions. And she focused in on her own granddaughter. And her granddaughter, Julie, lives in the Clinton area, so not super far from Fayetteville. And over time, Julie donated the wreath to the Poe House Museum, to the Cape Fear Historical Museum. And I think that was about 20 years after her grandmother had left it to her. So she did keep it and maintain it for some time. But again, it's sort of understandable with shifting tastes. Not everyone wants a wreath of hair from relatives you never knew from generations ago to decorate your house. So what do you do with these kinds of family heirlooms? And local history museums and state history museums are a great repository for ones that tell such intricate stories. So it's wonderful that we have that.
Well, Adrienne, I thank you for writing this fascinating article about hairwork, and it was called Fancy Work at the time. And it's a fascinating article. Again, it's in the July 2020 North Carolina Historical Review. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us. This will be also saved on YouTube. So again, thank you so much for taking time from your day, Adrienne, to talk about this. And to our viewers, thank you. Thank you for taking time from your day to listen.
Yeah, it was great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, hope to have you on again sometime. Thank you, everyone, and take care.